Okay, so last week we talked a little bit about our separate little identities. So our personal identity, regional identity, gender identity, stuff like that. And we are finally wrapping it up on, I think this has taken us, what, 3 days to look at identity development and how different people develop their identity in different ways, because it definitely depends on who you are, where you're from, and where you live. So we're going to look at minority identity development and majority or dominant identity development. So this is looking at like minority in the terms of, are you a minority or a majority in the country that you are living in? So if we look at the US, people of color would be a minority. However, if we look at places like China or Japan, if you are European or European American, then you are the minority. So the stages are pretty similar no matter really where you are. It just depends on, are you a minority where you are, or are you a majority? Right now we're in the US, so if you are European American of some descent, then you are probably more so within the majority. And if you are multiple races or a person of color, then you are probably more so within the minority. So for the first stage for minority identity development is unexamined identity. And if you are someone who's in a majority or dominant identity as well, it's pretty much the same or very similar to this as well. But there's just a lack of exploration. So if you're in the minority, you may accept the values and attitudes of the majority group, even if it means accepting some negative views on your own group as well. So you may have more of a desire to assimilate into the dominant culture and express more positive attitudes about the dominant culture. So if you're, a person of color living here in the United States in a majority white area, you might try more to assimilate to whatever the white culture is in that area. But if you're someone who is European American or a person of color, let's say living over in, Japan, you would try to assimilate to the Japanese culture. So it just depends on whatever the dominant culture is of the area. You could be, wherever, but you are trying to more so assimilate to whatever the dominant culture is there. And in this first stage, your ideas about identity may come from your parents, from your friends, or you just might not really be concerned about whatever your particular ethnicity is. You're not really thinking about it terribly much. It just might not be important to you at that time. The second stage in minority identity development is conformity. So you're starting to internalize the values and the norms of whatever the dominant group is. So your desire to assimilate is a little bit stronger. You may have negative views about yourself based on whatever the dominant culture considers the norm. So if I, am growing up in Japan or China or the Philippines or somewhere over in Asia, I definitely don't fit the norm. Let's just look at something as simple as like beauty standards. I might feel really bad about myself because I don't fit the ideal beauty standard of what women are in Japan. Like I am 5'7", I'm definitely more than, 120 pounds. So, I just might feel bad about myself because I don't fit whatever that ideal is for that particular culture. Maybe my hair's not dark enough. Maybe they want me to dye it at school so I fit in better, what have you. So people who criticize other members of their own group may be given negative labels. So if you're in this conformity stage, maybe you're talking bad about your own group and saying, oh, well, other members of my group are, gosh, they're such, lazy people or terrible people, or, all Americans are, bad tourists, or insert whatever here. And then, of course, the other people within that group might give you negative labels like, why are you betraying your cultural group this way? So this stage, this conformity stage, can definitely continue for a long time. It might continue until the people in that stage encounter situations such as like discrimination or prejudice that might cause them to question their superbly pro-dominant culture attitudes. So this third stage is resistance and separation or separatism. So, you know, after the person might get some prejudice or discrimination in stage 2, they might move to just giving a blanket endorsement of their entire culture that maybe they hadn't before. So they switch from being saying like, oh, well, we're going to endorse everything of the dominant culture to no, screw that, we're going to blanket endorse everything of the minority culture. So, but in this, they may be more motivated to learn about the culture and understand it more and see where they come from. Like, what is the origin of, you know, the ethnicity or whatever minority group that they may be in. So they're moving into reject maybe some of the values of the dominant group. And then stage 4 obviously is our ideal stage that we're trying to get to. This is our ideal outcome. So once you reach this stage, you have a strong sense of your own group identity, whatever that is, but you also have an appreciation of the other group. So you understand, like, you know, not everything is perfect about insert whatever minority group here. Not everything is perfect about insert whatever majority or dominant group here, but they both have good things that we can bring to the table and kind of start bridging those gaps. So these people will realize that racism, other forms of prejudice, discrimination do occur, but, you know, instead of just being angry about it and saying, oh, this is all, you know, your fault for, you know, being white or insert whatever thing here, it gets focused more on towards education and saying, you know, here's what's actually going on. You know, as someone who's part of a dominant group, they might not see all of the things that someone in a minority group does. They may not realize these things are going on. So it's directed towards more positive ends of education, actually communicating with people, interacting, talking, and then helping people get rid of those injustices and those discriminations. So, any questions so far about this? Okay, so now we're moving on to the 4 stages of majority identity development. So this is if you are part of a dominant group, and once again, depending on where you are, the dominant groups can change. A dominant group can be anything to, you know, race, it could be religion, it could be, you know, sexual orientation, what have you, whatever identity is dominant in a particular area. You know, you go to certain parts of Boston and like the religious dominant group is Catholic. You go to other parts, it's Protestant. You go to other parts, it's, well, probably not Baptist in Boston, but probably, I don't know. I'm just associating Boston with the Irish, and you got the Irish Protestant, or the Irish Protestants and the Irish Catholics. But like I said, stage 1 is very similar to the minority identity development, where you're just not really thinking about your identity in regards to being a member of a dominant or a majority group. Because as a member of a majority group, you know, it's not really something that we have to think about all the time. Just because, you know, a majority of the other people in whatever place we're at are the same as us in some way, shape, or form. So it might just not cross our mind that other people are different or have struggles because that they are different. Communication and relationships aren't based on racial or other differences. You know, you're just friends with whoever because, you know, you're friends with them. In this first stage, you may be aware of differences, but you're not fearful of other groups because of it, or you're not feeling superior to other groups. It just might not be something you're thinking about. Stage 2, so the internalization and acceptance of basic inequalities in society. So understanding that these things happen, and you might feel a little bit of guilt for that when you come to understand that. And because of that guilt, you may try to avoid interacting with, people who are different or people who are a minority because, some sense of, misplaced guilt, or it's like, oh, well, I don't know how to talk to these people now that I've come to realize that, there are inequalities in society. So you may have no conscious identification, is the way that this puts it, of being a member of this group. Because like I said, it's probably not something that we think about very much because the majority of other people might be like us in this way. But an example of this might be that whatever this minority group is would be culturally deprived and need to assimilate. So that white culture, so like Greek, Roman, stuff like that, is considered better or more classical, and other ones would be just like, oh, that's just like folk art, or that's folk music, rather than being like, no, that's, so is freaking like Greek art, like, is that not folk art too? But it's just the label we put on it, like, oh, this is classic and this is, wonderful and nice, and ballet is fancy, but African dances, that's just folk art. It's like, what's the difference? They're both 2,000 years old or whatever. Why is one classic and one folk? So some people never move beyond this acceptance stage. And in this one, they might, like I said, avoid interacting with other people, or they might take that patronizing stance of like, oh, well, my stuff's better than you, yours is just like not as good. But when people do move past this stage, then it's because they're actually talking with other people and getting to know them and making friends with people who are different than them. This resistance stage, you're moving from blaming people of the minority for their conditions, saying, oh, well, that's just the way it is. Like, if people worked harder in this group, then they could get it done, instead of realizing, like, there might be some institutional or social factors that help, keep this particular group down. You can't blame every single person in here for, them. You can't blame it all on the group for being this particular way, because there are other factors at work. The resistance may be passive or active. So passive, little behavior change. More active, acknowledging history, seeking out interactions, actually trying to take ownership, make a change. And then you may feel embarrassed if you had previously avoided or talked down to other people, because you might be realizing that, you've changed for the better now, and ashamed of your previous actions if you were previously avoiding or rude to other people. And then stage 4, this redefinition and reintegration. Once again, more of the ideal stage. So you're refocusing energy on redefining, who you are, or whatever your dominant trait is, in more positive terms, and being able to re-say, okay, there are good things about my group. I don't have to be ashamed of being a member of whatever this dominant group is. I don't have to feel ashamed of being white, or of being Catholic, or of being a man, or whatever the dominant trait is in whatever area. So you can, like I said, you can see the positive aspects of it. You're able to appreciate other groups and see what they have that is good, but also see what they have that might be a little negative as well, and seeing the negative and the positive in your own group. The recognition that, prejudice of many kinds can and does definitely exist in society, but blaming yourself, feeling guilty, or even denying that it happens it's not going to solve anything. So, being able to say, okay, yes, this stuff happens. So what can we do to make a better, more positive environment for everyone in order to, keep positive change going so that in the future, my kids, my nieces and nephews hopefully don't have to deal with it as much as I did or my parents or grandparents did. So any questions so far on this? And like I said, minority and majority or dominant, it definitely depends on where you are. It will change based on society. And then when we're talking about those characteristics of whiteness, we're going to be looking at particularly like in the United States, because that's what the textbook that I am using looks at it from. So some things to think about: what's it mean to be quote unquote white here in the US, and the characteristics of a white identity. Spoiler alert, most people who are European American aren't going to be able to tell you, because it's just something that like we do unconsciously and don't really think about. Someone who is not European American could probably tell you more of what the characteristics of whiteness are, because they might have been excluded from it, or they might be able to have that outside perspective and say, oh no, like in general, this is what you guys tend to do. This is how you guys celebrate like 4th of July, or this is how you celebrate these particular American holidays, and that's part of that culture of being European American. But in regards to the US, 3 common characteristics that tend to be shared by the European Americans. So the advantage of race, so the advantage of just being a majority. So we don't have to really think about the consequences of our race. If I get pulled over, I don't really have to worry about anything bad happening to me. 1, because I'm European American, and 2, because I'm a woman. What cop's gonna shoot a 20-something-year-old white girl? Probably very few, unless I really, really did something bad. But someone who is, a Black American, that's something that they do have to think about, especially if you look over the course of the history, 5 years even of the US, where you've had multiple African Americans who have been shot and killed by police. So that's definitely something that they do have to think about. They have to think about the consequences of what they look like on a more daily basis, whereas someone who is European American in the US doesn't have to think about it. If you're Hispanic in the US, you might have to worry about, if you get pulled over, if they're gonna start asking you, it's like, oh, are you a citizen? Where are you from? Do you speak English? Blah, blah, blah. Cardi, you're over there laughing. Have you got that before? Getting stopped by Border Patrol. Border Patrol has never stopped me. But, if someone is darker skinned or more ethnic looking, then you might get stopped, because it's like, oh, he's driving a big truck. I wonder what he's carrying in there. Like, and that's just, that's something that you have to think about when you drive down to Tucson or Nara Vista. I don't even know where Nara Vista is. It just sounds like it'd be south. Or down to El Paso or whatever. You're probably have to think about, okay, how many times am I going to get stopped by Border Patrol here? Or if someone is Middle Eastern, or if they're a Sikh from India and they wear the head turban, how many times do they get stopped for a random check at the airport? That's probably not something any of us in here who are European Americans think about. We don't. But it might be something we have to think about if we go overseas, where then we are more of a minority. What is the view of people who are white in other countries? Is it a positive view? Is it a negative view? Am I going to have to worry more about being checked up at the airport? If I'm an American and I go to Russia, do I have to worry about all my calls being tracked? That's just like a general American thing. But if I go to the Middle East, as someone who is white, is that going to affect how people treat me? But if you're looking at the US, if you're European American, you don't really have to think about race too much. the standpoint from which people who are European American view themselves. So how we view ourselves and race obviously influence how we communicate with other people. So if you are European American, then you probably are under the assumption that race relations in the US are relatively positive. However, if you're a person of color, you might have a different view, especially if we look at the past 5 years. Sorry, this book's a little bit older, but you know, if you looked at it over the past 20 years, most European white Americans would say, yeah, you know, stuff's good, like everyone's equal. But if you ask a Black American or African American, like how race relations have been over the past 20 years, probably a very different answer, or what the poverty rates are like, or how easy it is to access healthcare. And then our set of cultural practices. So like I said, this one's really hard for if you are European American in the US. It's really hard for us to kind of put our finger on this because a lot of it's just things we do unconsciously. But the biggest one is individualism and being an individualist. If you are a white European American, chances are you are an individualist and you were raised individualistically. If you are someone who is of a different ethnic group, then you might be more collectivist. So people who were raised in like Asian and Hispanic households tend to be more collectivist. But those are some of our cultural practices, like how we raise kids. Do we kick them out of the house when they turn 18, et cetera, that vary between Americans. So any questions on that? Okay. So according to my notes, I'm gonna say this is probably from like 2015 or something. There's approximately 7 million multiracial people in the United States. So that means 2 or more races. You know, over the past couple of years, it has probably grown, and it will continue to grow over the next decades. You know, there'll probably be a point in the future where, you know, most people are of 2 or more races. But so if you are biracial and multiracial, your identity might develop differently because you may have a minority identity development and also a majority identity development, depending on where you are. You may be rejected by both groups because you don't you don't act, you know, this group enough, or you don't look this group enough. But most children would want to embrace both groups and have, you know, all the positive aspects of their identity, you know, come together and be able to, you know, form one identity with the good things from the minority and the majority identity that they have, or the 2 minority identities or the 2 majority identities. Luckily, most people don't really find it terribly difficult to manage it, and so they don't feel marginalized, but it is definitely possible. But when you have, you know, when you can be accepted by all the groups that you're a part of, you know, it does feel good. And those positive aspects would be, you know, you have a foot in 2 different worlds or 3 different worlds. You're able to communicate with people from different cultures because maybe, you know, one set of your grandparents is Japanese, maybe one is American, maybe one of those grandparents also married someone from, you know, another culture. So you have all those different things to learn about and be exposed to. So global nomads, third culture kids. So if your parents moved around a lot, if they were military, if they were missionaries, anything like that, then you might be a global nomad. So this, you know, it's pretty beneficial to people to get out and travel because you develop more resilience. When you learn more about other people, you can learn more about yourself, you get more resilient, you get more adaptable, you become more tolerant of differences, you become more worldly and understanding how the world works. And those are all extremely important for the world we live in now, where we have such huge multinational corporations. They want people who are adaptable, who know how to talk to people from all over the world, who know how to make friends and build rapport. And then, well, just with this point, anyone can become more multicultural. Anyone can develop a multicultural identity. So if you have long-term relationships, whether they be friendships or romantic relationships, or if you're a child of immigrants, then you can definitely have a multicultural identity. But it takes time to develop. So it's not like an instantaneous thing of like, oh, I did a presentation on, China, so now I'm multicultural. That's a step in the right direction, but, it's more than just learning. It's being exposed and interacting with people from that culture. And then, of course, adaptation. So adapting to new cultures. Culture shock is always really, really fun to talk about. And like when we have like the big class groups, when not COVID times, it's really fun to get everyone's different experiences with culture shock, because people have some really wild stories. I think you guys have like typed out some too, because I think someone, man, I don't know if it was this class or the other one, they were talking about how they went over to their friend's house and like the dog jumped up on the couch or whatever, and she made a comment of like, man, y'all just let anybody in here or something. And the family was very not enthused that she had made a comment that like, of course the dog's family, of course it's allowed on the couch. But I still remember that because it was funny. But that's, individual family culture shock, but it could be, other things. But this U-curve theory is you have that high of you're really excited, you're anticipating traveling, you're excited about, this new experience of, going off to college, of traveling to the Philippines, of going to, meet someone for the first time in Peru or whatever. And you get there and the excitement's high and it's high, and then you start realizing that things are unfamiliar and uncomfortable, and you kind of drop on that U until you're at the very bottom where you're having this culture shock of disorientation. There's discomfort because you don't know really how to act. Things are unfamiliar. Let's say you get to Peru and you're like, oh my gosh, why are there guinea pigs for sale in the street? It's like, why are people barbecuing guinea pigs on the street? Or if you're going out to a restaurant somewhere overseas, you're like, how do I call the waitress or waiter over? Maybe they just leave you alone for the whole time. You're just sitting there thinking like, I need a refill, or I don't know what's on my plate. How do I eat this? Like, they didn't give me any utensils. Am I supposed to eat with my hands? Like, what? So you're trying to figure out how to act in that culture because your familiar cues aren't there. So like, we know if we're in a restaurant here and we want something, we can make eye contact with our waiter or waitress, right? If it's really busy, we might make eye contact and like put our hand up a little bit to just be like, hey, please, over here, I need something. Or, when we ask for the check, do we pay at the table or do we pay up there? Is it appropriate to leave a tip or not? But sorry, I'm thinking about food because it's almost lunchtime. But, we don't have that. So, we're at this very bottom of our culture shock. And then as we stay there longer, we adapt more. So we get back more comfortable and we know now, okay, this is how we behave in a restaurant. This is how we greet people. These are the customs that we need to follow in order to fit in. So we know now that we need to like, wave the waiter over like this. Because if we do this, this is how you call a dog, and they're going to be very offended. Or, this is the appropriate amount to leave a tip. Or you don't leave a tip because it's insulting to the restaurant owner because you're saying he doesn't pay his people enough. Or whatever it is. But once we get used to it, we get back on that, high of like, woohoo, I love it here. This is so exciting. I feel like those slides should have been switched. whoops, oh well, maybe backtracking slightly, my apologies. But going back to being multicultural and multicultural identities, getting a new sense of self. So you're thriving on these margins of these cultures. So you're able to pick and choose the best of both worlds in order to build a better self, in order to communicate better with all of the people around you. So when you're getting this intercultural personhood, that's the most positive one. So you want to be constructive, you want to build a good identity and have these intercultural experiences and be able to interact well and help others. Unfortunately, you can also create an encapsulated identity where you might be torn between different identities. So you might have trouble making decisions, be troubled by ambiguity, or feel pressure from both groups. So let's say you're someone from India who marries an American. Those are two very, very different cultures. You may have pressure from your family to act and behave one way, and then you may have pressure from your American spouse to act a different way. And you may never be able to merge those two into a constructive identity where you're thriving on both ends. You might just stick with that struggle of butting heads between those two identities. Things are possible to overcome, but once you get to that stage, it just becomes harder. Because once you get stuck in something, then you feel stuck. It's hard to get out of it, but it is always possible. Okay. And then our last two slides. Thank goodness, because legit, we're almost out of time. Okay, take a deep breath. We're almost done. So this post-ethnicity refers to a growing willingness to cross cultures and the evolution of a nation in which personal identity, so the things that you choose to be identified with, so like as a gardener or a teacher or someone who loves big trucks and mudding and going to the dunes or whatever, is, it's fluid and more accepted, and people judge you more based on that rather than your ethnic heritage, your skin color, or other things that you cannot change. So, why might we not be yet living in one of these? So, who knows? People get comfortable in what they know and what they do. So that could definitely be a reason. There might be people in power who are unwilling to give up the power in order to share it. I can't tell you that because I'm not a psychic. I don't know the answer to everything. So then the question is, what can we do to help, contribute to the betterment? Well, we cannot judge people on first glance. We can say, okay, well, because so-and-so looks Hispanic, they must be an illegal immigrant, or their parents must have been, or they're lazy, or, they're poor or whatever. It's like, no, we should not be doing that to people. Or just because, oh, this person, looks this way. Not judge people based on their racial or ethnic heritage. They can't change that. Not judge people based on their gender. Most people are very, very unwilling to go through and change that. Not judge people based on their sexual orientation, what they do for a living, stuff like that, and say, okay, well, what are your good qualities, or maybe some bad qualities too, but let's judge you on your choices rather than your physical appearance or other things that you can't change. So this is just kind of a wrap up from what we said at the beginning. Not a smooth process developing your identity. They are created through communication, through existing social context in relation to other people. They're dynamic, so they're subject to negotiation, subject to change, and they are complex and they are multiple. So you're not just a husband, or you're not just a teacher, you're not just a student. So some things that we can do to build these skills. So become more conscious of your own identities and how they relate to how you interact with other people. How do people perceive you based on the identities that you are presenting? Be aware of how you assign identities to other people. So try not to judge people just based on how they look at first. Try to get to talk to them, get to know them, see how they, describe themselves before you go ascribing things to them. Practice communicating with other people. That makes, that helps affirm who they are. Obviously, if it's a very negative identity, like I'm a serial killer, you probably should not affirm that. But, just treat others basically how you want to be treated. And it's always interesting to talk about your identities with your friends. Go through and say, how would you describe yourself? See what people come up with, because maybe there's things about your friends and your acquaintances that you never knew. Maybe you never knew that one of your best friends was like a master gardener, and their entire, they have an entire greenhouse offsite that's just full of like these beautiful plants, and you would have never known unless you'd been like, hey, what are some things that you want to tell me about or whatever. So any questions, comments, concerns as we wrap it up? Looks like we got George in. Was there anyone else who popped in late?
Me, Xavier.
Oh, Xavier, okay. So, all right, well, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording.